do today is spend some time really sharing with you some of the work I'm doing on academic leadership at the university, and try to link that to a certain extent in some of the work that the Lodge is doing in building a leadership program. And I've had the opportunity and the pleasure to work with a fine group of men over, I guess, the last year, thinking about academic leadership that can be applied to your organization. And reflecting on academic leadership, there's really, I think, three areas where there's a common theme between what you're doing and what I'm trying to accomplish with the Provo at Ryerson University. And the first one is at the individual level, to actually provide a program where you can provide information, notions of leadership, concepts of leadership, and applications of leadership for the individual. So they, in effect, can perhaps be better in their work, better in their life, and perhaps better in their organization. They may not take on a leadership role, but they understand the notions of leadership and how they, in effect, can contribute to making things better. At the second level, at the university, it's building chairs for departments, directors of research institutes, to hopefully create an environment where those programs can grow, students are empowered, faculty members have some freedom to develop, etc., and you create an environment that is really proactive. And I think that's one of the things you're trying to accomplish at your lodges. And finally, at the university level, we're trying to create a program which in effect translates itself into the leaders of the university. So provosts understand what's going on, presidents, chancellors, etc., understand the university environment. And I think that's one of the objectives in the long run of the program that you're building as well, to translate those leadership notions throughout the organization. And what you're really talking about is building a culture of leadership, a culture of inclusion, a culture of participation. So that's one of the things I'll try to accomplish today. Now, reflecting back on your organization and universities, there's a lot of similarities, you know. We're both very, very old organizations. The first university is the University of Bologna. It goes back to 1088. Then the University of Paris, and then Oxford, and then Cambridge, etc. And certainly if you trace the roots of Freemasonry back, you're also an ancient organization. So that's one similarity. The other one is we're legacy-based. There's cultures, there's values inherent in a university. There's values and culture inherent in your organization. We're both diverse. We're both value-driven. And I think one of the negatives of being old institutions is we can become complacent with our own organization. And that's a thing to fight, and that's a thing I think that leadership can take on, to deal with that complacency. And we're all dealing with challenges. All organizations face challenge. And one of them is the disruptive nature of the environments we operate in. We're living in what David Naylor said a couple of years ago to your organization, turbulent times. And David Naylor happens to be the president, or was the president, of the University of Toronto. And I think if we look at what's going on in our society, they require new solutions. We're dealing with social media. We're dealing with a new generation who have different expectations of what values are, perhaps. And perhaps we have to look at new forms of leadership within our organizational units. Different ways of doing it, if you want. Now, I'll give you my rationale for doing leadership. When I was retiring as dean, a number of folks came to me and said, Ken, we'd like to honor you in some way. Well, I said, that's very nice of you to honor me. And I think they were thinking, well, Ken would probably like student scholarships in his name. Well, that really didn't interest me. Not that I wasn't interested in students, but students had a lot of scholarships, and I really didn't want a scholarship in my name. Then they said, well, maybe you want a plaque on a door, the Ken Jones Lecture Theater. Wouldn't that be great? And that's the last thing I wanted, you know, the Ken Jones Lecture Theater. What the hell is that all about? And what I did, they said, what would you like? And I said, well, I'm honored you're here. And I reflected for perhaps about 2 minutes. And I said, you know, what I'd really like to do is build a leadership program within this university. I said, that's something I never heard talked about. And I certainly could have benefited from it. And that sort of took them a bit by surprise. A leadership program. Okay. And they went out and they raised a huge amount of money. It was in like 6 digits. And then I feel obligated. You know, I'm going off to retire, I'm going to travel, and all of a sudden I put myself in this position of obligation. So in effect, why did I think of that? Well, in my university, leadership was manuals, management manuals. And they're the farthest thing away from leadership, honest to goodness. Manuals tell you, I suppose, when you're in trouble, what you should have done. You know, look at the HR manual, look at the finance manual. We had rows of manuals. And there certainly was process there, and there certainly was governance there. But managers do things right, and leaders do the right thing. And that's the fundamental difference. So what I found by talking to people, there was some interest in this. And the university and departments were finding themselves in some difficulty about succession. Who's going to succeed? And if you don't have a leadership program in place, it becomes almost a by chance somehow. People come to the top, or perhaps you're getting the leaders, people who want to be leaders, and sometimes they're the worst people to be leaders. Okay? So in effect, how do you in effect develop succession within your organization towards leadership positions? That is a process. How do you leverage existing talent? And we had a lot of talent in the university. And quite often, many of those folks didn't even think of a leadership position, but they would have been wonderful leaders. Okay? And finally, we wanted to develop a program to support existing leaders. So you're dealing with the present, you're dealing with the future, and you're dealing, in effect, with both existing issues and hopefully long-term ones. And ultimately, we wanted to build a leadership-run organization where leadership was something to really put up as an important issue within the environment, importance of leadership. So that was the raison d'etre. Now, I don't know about Freemasonry and your history of leadership, but I can tell you within the university environment, I was there 43 years, and I went through at least 3 transformations. For the first period of my life, it was a command and control environment. It was the Herr Professor. He ran the department, or she ran the department. It was almost ruled by king or queen. There was very little discussion, okay? Over a period of time, you were the endowed professor. Very little chance for a younger faculty member to see career paths. They simply kept their nose under the rampart, if you want. Didn't really speak up too much in meetings. And in effect, it was a very staid environment. And then I went through a period of a servant leader. The leader really viewed themselves as the servants of their, in effect, department or their university. And again, not a little, and people relied on this person. There wasn't a lot of discussion or really, I think, moving forward. And finally, during the last period of my involvement at the university, I saw departments moving into what is called distributed leadership, collaboration based on trust, an open culture, a flat organization, if you want, where all levels have involved. We start talking about stakeholders within the organization. Stakeholders at the university were students. Stakeholders were alumni. Stakeholders were, in effect, staff. Stakeholders were, in effect, obviously, the faculty. And together, you empowered people to, in effect, develop change. That's a sea change in culture. And I see many organizations are moving in that direction. Well, what do we talk about distributed leadership? Well, it's shared governance. And I found out one of the things I've learned over time, organizations, whether it's departments, whether it's faculty, whether it's universities, get into difficulty when 3 things get messed up: communication, process, and governance. If you keep those things straight, you can have differences of opinion, but no one can really claim that there was a flaw in how things were done. You establish your governance, you establish your rules of communication, and you establish your process. That's your responsibility in any organization. They're not the same. But when you spend time on those things, when you really care about communicating, really care about process, and really care about governance, then I think your organization is in good shape. There is a structure. I think that's where we go wrong. We often go wrong. And I think we've distributed leadership view things as a social process. There's joint decision making, there's openness, there's networks, there's shared roles. And notice how that is fairly close to a lot of the stuff that's going on in social media. It's a different technology, but there's a link in terms of the concepts and the constructs. And ultimately, it's an environment which is empowering, transparent, and collegial. Now you have to make some decisions. Is that the organization you want? Do you want an organization which has values that relate to empowerment, transparency, and collegiality? And certainly, I know some of in talking to Dan and other people within your organization, I know you are extremely collegial. I know the process I dealt with on leadership was certainly transparent. But I really don't know how empowering it's going to be. But I do know that those elements are at least present in the subcommittee I had the pleasure to work with. Now, distributed leadership, I won't go through all of this, but it's the attempt to establish rules and protocols, to seek information, to involve diversity, etc. And there's intelligent risks you sometimes take. I'll leave you to look at that later. The concerns are it can be damn slow. You're not dealing with dictums. You're dealing with discussion. It can be hijacked by special interest groups. It can be highly political. Groups can really take on, but I mean, you have to be aware of these things. And there are barriers, certainly barriers. And one of the barriers are existing hierarchies. There are barriers to distributed leadership. Information that flows from the top down all the time. It's control. So you're fighting these types of things. But I can tell you in the long run, for the entire organization, it's a way you can create leaders throughout the organization. People feel involved. People feel they're part of the process. People feel they can make a difference. People are involved in change. And that, or if you want to keep things the way they are, they're involved in status quo. But at least they're involved. They're part of the process. Now, I've talked a little bit about this, the need for the program at Ryerson I felt was a need, the lack of leadership at all within the organization, discussions of leadership. And I've developed a program which I think the fundamentals is learn from leaders. I've developed a series of components. There's 12 modules. It's over 6 full days. They're spread out one a month. And we bring in leaders who are recognized in their field. And they, in effect, don't lecture. They, in effect, discuss important elements of leadership. And hopefully people take those elements back to their environment and apply them. Give you some examples of who these folks are. One of the things we deal with at universities is labor negotiations. Oddly enough, we always seem to be in negotiation. Well, the person we have discussing negotiations is Buzz Hargrove. Buzz Hargrove, you can perhaps not agree with his politic, but you can't disagree with his experience in negotiations. I mean, he's probably one of the premier labor union leaders in this country, and he's worked very well in partnership with industry, actually. In terms of dealing with negotiations, we have an ex-cabinet minister, federal government, in the Chrétien government, who is very, very involved in negotiations in a whole series of levels. So we bring folks in who in effect are experts. And I look at this organization, 50,000 members in this province, if I read the data correctly. The leaders you have at your disposal to get involved in a program like this is remarkable. You have a huge network, a huge resource base, which can be brought in to help, to mentor, to coach, to participate in a leadership program. I'll give you a very simple story. I was talking to the people at Harvard, and they were developing a leadership program. And there were two people that wanted the program, two groups. One was the president. President of Harvard wanted a leadership program. And his rationale was Harvard wasn't turning out as many leaders as Yale. Well, probably that's not the best rationale to develop a leadership program. There was another group led by the provost, the head academic, who had a different view. And she said, we need a program to really translate fundamental leadership skills within our organization. Once they got that together, they were able to bring in some of the top people in the US because they were attached to Harvard. So the analogy is, within your organization, you have a wonderful resource base if you wanted to include them in a program like this. Now, understanding issues, I really broke down issues in leadership into three things. Context, you have to understand the context in which your organization is faced. What's the environment you're faced with where leaders have to take on various issues and get people involved? So the first thing is understanding the context. What are the issues facing Freemasonry within this province? What are the issues faced with your lodge? What is the issues you are dealing with on a day-to-day basis? What are the issues you see 4 or 5 years down the road? They may be similar to the ones that the universities face. In some cases, they'll be different. But without that context, you're not addressing the needs. Based on that, what are some of the tactical issues you have to deal with? What are some of the strategic issues? And once you get into a leadership program, it isn't a one-year program. It's a long-term commitment. It's a long-term issue. So those are some of the issues. Now, Ryerson example, we did it to identify future leaders. Who were the future leaders within the organization? Where are they? Ryerson has 1,000 faculty members. Who are they out there? The provost doesn't know. The chair often doesn't know. You're dealing with 50 or 60 people within your organization. Is succession a problem? I can tell you in all organizations it's a problem. No organization I'm aware of does not have succession as a concern. And the other things I've talked about, existing talent. Now, no leadership program goes forward with any organization unless there's support from the top. It just won't happen. The leaders of the organization have to support a leadership program. It would be odd if they didn't. Think of a leader who wouldn't support a leadership program. That's a fundamental question. It speaks a lot about the leader. And is that the type of leader you want? It's the organization's choice. Now, some of the issues facing the context, the fundamental one was administration versus leadership. An administrator or a leader. They're both important. Leaders have to be supported by excellent administrators. Not all administrators are great leaders. Not all great leaders are great administrators. Different skill sets sometimes. And maybe you have that translation from a COO or a CFO into a CEO. You may. But it may be a disaster too. It may be. Okay? You have to look at the skill base you require, and do these individuals have that skill base? And I guess the other fundamental question, do you really want to be a leader? Leadership is not without its challenges. Leadership is not without some of the things you give up. And I can tell you, as a very young academic, I was in a department, I was chair of a department at a fairly young age. And the real leader of that department was not me. The real leader of that department was the individual who was the moral authority in the department. This person had the support because he, in effect, could sit back and say really, really, really bright things. He was wise. I don't think as a young man I was particularly wise as a leader, but he was. And I'm sure within every organization there are these individuals, which really are almost the conscience of the organization. They, in effect, often have some of the key values of the association or that are embedded, and they're very important folks. Now, I'll go through some of the challenges, the context that universities are facing right now, and you can reflect on whether they relate to your organization. All universities are dealing with less funding. Budget cuts of 2% a year, over and over and over again. And how universities have coped with that is taking in more students. Okay, increase the numbers. But notwithstanding, it's difficult. So the funding issue is there. I don't know if that's an issue with your lodges or with your organization, but it may well be. The second one is disruptive technology. In the university context, one of the major issues we're dealing with is massive online courses. In other words, courses that are free often over the net. Offered by Harvard or Stanford or U of T, I think, is in a collaboration. So technological shifts, disruptive technologies. Third one is demographic shifts. And certainly within the university, it's an aging population, but it's also a population that is becoming, in certain of our environments, certain of our cities, more diverse. I'm sure that's affecting your organization. Difficulty in attracting and retaining highly qualified people. Does that relate to your organization? Certainly within a university, we're all fighting for the top professors. They're tough to get. As a dean of business, the most difficult people to attract were accountants with PhDs. Why? Because very few accountants go on to get a PhD. And secondly, if you want to be in an accredited business school, a certain proportion of your faculty in each department have to have PhDs. So I was faced with a false economy. I could get a marketing professor for $120,000, $110,000 to start. To get an accountant with a PhD, I had to start him at $180,000. And still I couldn't get them, because U of T had given $220,000. Blame Dan for everything. I also was faced with an aging professoriate. And why was that the case? Well, it was a change in the law in the province. You didn't have to retire at 65. So if you're a prof at 65, you get your pension, and also you get $150,000, $60,000 a year. So you teach 6 hours a week for 12 weeks, a term, and you're getting $250,000. What wife is going to let you quit? Finally, there was a real different shift in student needs and behaviors. I mean, the student of the 2015 is a much different person than the students certainly of 2000 or certainly from 1980. So the needs, the behaviors, the attitudes, the expectations had changed radically. And that's a shift. And if you're not responding to your market in the appropriate way, what are students looking for? Well, they're looking for a good education, but they're also looking for opportunity. They're looking for involvement. They're looking for they're looking for variations in how programs are offered. They want stuff on the weekend. They want stuff late at night. They want stuff on the web. There's a whole series of pressures in terms of the offer. And finally, there were consistent union management issues. So those were some of the challenges that we were faced with. And this is the tactical issues we came up with within our program. Okay, I talked about but conflict resolution, how to have difficult conversations. How to have that difficult conversation. And there's ways of doing that. There's strategies to having a difficult conversation that helps you in life. It also helps you in any organization. And you learn how to do these. So we have folks come in who are really expert in cognitive psychology. They're experts in terms of having gone through this on a day-to-day basis. They provide advice to young chairs in terms of having that first difficult conversation. How to run a meeting. How to deal with issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion. These are all issues which are tactical. They're all issues that are important to run an organization that effectively, particularly within a university. And then we had the more strategic issues of team building, visioning, building partnerships, linking expectation, futures to budgets, understanding finance, and ethical decision making. These are all strategic issues, and I'm sure some of these your organization deals with on a day-to-day basis. How to build a team, how to develop a strategy, how to implement a strategy. We all have 5-year plans. How many of them are really implemented? So how to integrate, if you want, groups of people working on issues. If I had been if I was dean now, I would have made one fundamental change in process within my faculty. We had a whole series of groups that were meeting on curriculum, and groups that were meeting on hiring, and groups that were meeting on strategy and 5-year plans. They didn't talk to one another. So if you have a strategic plan, it better be linked to hiring. If you have a strategic plan, it better be linked to curriculum. And so how do these things work in an integrated fashion? And too often they're siloed. And the only person that tries to put them all together is the dean. Well, if you're dealing with distributed leadership, that's the wrong process. You get people involved. And you have a group that really tries to integrate the key parts of the process that you're engaged in, the planning processes, and we're all engaged in those processes. And I'm certain that this organization is a whole series of committees dealing with a whole range of topics. Do they talk to one another? Really talk to one another? Or are they running as individual silos? In my experience at the university, we did not talk to one another. Committees were separate entities. It's not a recipe for success. It's a recipe for more committees. It's a recipe often for non-action. Well, that's another issue. Does your leadership want change? Certainly within the university, there's a lot of people that don't want change. So the mentoring and coaching, very important part of the process. It isn't just building a program, it's in effect developing mentors and coaches. It's an ongoing process, and in my case, I had 2 types of mentors and coaches. Each person who takes the program will have a coach or mentor, one-on-one. So if you take this year program, you will have a mentor you can go and talk to. But there'll also be a mentor for special skills. Not all mentors can know about finance. So we'll have one mentor who can really talk about university finance. We'll have another mentor talking about HR problems. Another mentor talking about union issues. So they are special skills, and you may not use them at all, but that person's available to any one of the 12 people if they need help in those areas. We're also going to institute a process of booster shots, and a year ago I ran a mock program, or a pilot program, which in effect 5 people took. They want booster shots. And what that is, the ability to come back and talk to someone about, we want this somehow to keep going. I want a little more information about this, and we're calling it booster shots, and I stole that from Harvard. And we're really trying to link the present to the past in a way. So there's some continuity that you understand culture, you build culture, but you building culture from understanding what's gone before you. Now, I've come up with some attributes of leadership that certainly I think are important. And these are just one word, but they hopefully one word speaks more than one idea. Good leaders listen. Good leaders are authentic. Good leaders are transparent. I think good leaders provide opportunities for people around them. They respond, they're decisive, they make decisions. The last thing you want in a leader is a leader that doesn't make decisions. You expect to go in and at least, if not immediately, have a response within a reasonable period of time. When I was dean and when I was chair and when I ran a research institute, I developed a process which I think stood me very well. Every conversation I had was the most important conversation of that day. I may have had 40 conversations in a day as a dean. Probably for the person having that conversation with me, it was the most important conversation of the day, if not the most important conversation of the week. It was a student going to see the dean. It was a faculty member worried about tenure. It was an alumni contemplating a gift. Well, that was the most important conversation of the week for me. But I can tell you, for me, each conversation had to be the most important for that period of time. And you find if that's the case, you're prepared for it, you take interest in it, you don't try to rush people out of the room. And I found out that paid off a lot of dividends. With loyalty, people felt they could go and talk to you. There was an openness. And I think it was we're developing a culture of inclusion. I think good leaders should be passionate and optimistic. The last thing you want is a I found very early if I walked the halls or went into a meeting looking troubled, everyone thought we were being closed down. So the leader always has to be overly optimistic. Things are good, even though they may not be great. You in effect are creating a positive environment. You have to be approachable, you have to fight complacency. I think you have to over-deliver to a certain extent, under-promise. You have to be able to simplify things. You have to be able to talk to people in a language which they understand, and that doesn't mean you're simple, but you take hopefully a complex problem and you're able to distill it into some component parts. And probably the thing I learned as dean, you have to be grateful. You're nothing more than the custodian. In some cases you're an orchestra leader, but you're there for a period of time. The period of time, the people that are there the longest are the support staff. They're there for 30 or 40 years. They really run the organization. They know the network. And all you are as a leader is someone that's had the chance and the opportunity and the good fortune to operate a position for a short period of time. And hopefully during that one, you don't mess up too much, and hopefully you make it a little better than what it was, and hopefully you've hired some good people, and hopefully you've tackled some problems and made things a little better. And the last thing I learned is you never tolerate a bully. And there's a couple of types of bullies. There's the passive-aggressive bully, and the guy that comes in and really yells at you and tries to, in effect, bully you into solutions. Never tolerate a bully. It never works. It never works. And if you don't deal with it quickly, it'll just fester. And I found out that pretty quickly. And bullies often manage up really well. They don't manage down, believe me. The other thing I found as a leader, you need a mirror to look in the back. You need a telescope, and sometimes you need a microscope. But you have to view things from a variety of perspectives and visions, I suppose. The new issue with the leadership under distributed leadership, besides those other terms, you need to have emotional intelligence. And certainly if you read the literature about leadership in the last 10 years, emotional intelligence is one of the key attributes. And that is where you have to have compassion and empathy. You have to share successes, and you have to have a strength of character that builds respect. So emotional intelligence is perhaps now, when you look at the literature, some of the key issues that leaders have to have. And with that, you have to have the willingness to act, to execute change, to see the big picture, to ask smart questions, to have a conviction, to have a willingness, in effect, to not deal with cronyism, to exhibit loyalty but not cronyism. So there's a series of fundamental directions, I think, which leaders should have. And there are some sins of leadership: muzzling voices, acting phony, skipping the fun stuff, not listening, stressing results over values, and having a control and command mentality. Those to me are some of the sins of leadership, which I felt as a dean, and I leave it to you whether or not you think those are sins in your organization. And there are some axioms, I suppose, and the primary one is leadership is not power or position, it's influence. Your ability to influence change, to be developed be part of a process. Leadership is earned, not bestowed. I believe that. And the last point I've already mentioned. Good managers are not necessarily good leaders, but in effect, that's the case. Now, IBM did a survey about 5 years ago, and this is what they were looking for in CEOs, what CEOs said were important, and enlisted. And if you were a CEO starting this decade, they were looking for people who were creative, that had integrity, that could globally think, have influence, be open, have dedication, have humility, and have fairness. And those were rank ordered. And it was a rather surprising list that they were looking for, where they really had creativity at the top and fairness at the bottom, oddly enough. Now, as I said earlier, I've been working with a wonderful group of individuals and just sitting in on meetings and perhaps offering a little advice here and there, but I can tell you it's a great group. And it's the Leadership Workshop Committee. And the chair is Bill Bowick, and he is, and I must say that People travel long distances for these meetings, huge distances. We would hold them in Belleville, and people would come from Hamilton, they'd come from near Ottawa. We'd hold them in Ajax, and they'd come huge distances, and they'd get up at 5 in the morning to get there, and they'd spend the day thinking about and hopefully working for the betterment of this organization. And I do give a lot of respect to the people on that list, and many of you know who they are, and there's at least one in this room, Dan, and Dan got me involved in the group, and I've been very honored to have the pleasure of working with them. And what they've done over the last period of time is a variety of things. They've done an awful lot of things on behalf of the organization. They've identified leadership roles and required competencies across your organization. They've developed, I think, a wonderful matrix that does this. It took a while to do, and there was a lot of discussion back and forth, and everyone participated, and no one took, no one's view was not heard. They've certainly undergone a survey across the organization. Hopefully some of you have participated, if not all of you. They produced a discussion paper called Mentoring and Leadership Development Potential, which I hope you've read, or it's been distributed. They've undertook a leadership competency analysis. They've designed a series of leadership workshops, which I think will be running. They've developed a set of leadership case studies. I happen to think case is a wonderful way to learn. And they've taken some fundamental cases and that apply to your organization, and hopefully you'll have the opportunity to become involved in those cases. And they proposed a rollout plan. So that's an awful lot of work to have accomplished on a volunteer basis over, I guess, about a year. And I really do give my full support to what they've done. It's really been a wonderful opportunity. And this is what they have suggested for the leadership program. The program obviously has to be based on Masonic ethics and values, and emphasize personal development and influence rather than organizational structure and power. And that's a pretty important statement. It's about the individual. And I think that's what leadership is about. It's about the relationship of one-on-one. It's people working together, empowering people, getting people involved. They have a variety of delivery formats, and that respects disruptive technologies, for sure. It's electronic, it's webinar, and it's partially cost recovery. That sort of sounds like a university. And it focuses on the principle of centered leadership, and it's multi-module in development. And they have developed or proposing 6 modules, and they've spent time thinking about what they should be. And there's some suggested content, etc., and I think they're well underway. The first one is, what does it mean to be a leader? Do you want to be a leader? That was a fundamental question I raised in part of my discussion. Tapping your own potential. It's making good men better. But how do you tap your own potential? We all have skills. We all want to contribute to making things better. You're in an organization which is one of the fundamental values. How do you transition into leadership positions? One of my challenges is, how do you transition out of leadership positions? But you're always transitioning. And that's a role too. You go through leadership, and I'm sure through this organization you go through leadership. And you have a series of past leaders that have a lot to offer, and how do you get them involved in the process? There's often a vacuum when you leave, and how do you get them involved? That's learn from leaders. But so transitioning out is rather transitioning in, and maybe I've added a component there and I shouldn't have, but I have it. Bringing out the best in others, that's the listening aspect, leadership strategies, and a program that really sums up and wraps up the whole session. I'm going to finish with a couple of slides. The first one is some leadership quotes, and I really think these, to me, summarize what other folks have said, other leaders have said about leadership. And the first one comes from Proverbs 29, verse 18, where there's no vision, people perish. And I think that's something you should reflect on. Without vision, people perish. The second one comes from, a business leader, Warren Bennis, a writer actually. Leadership is the capacity of translating vision into reality. And so that's one of the challenges the leaders of this organization have, the leaders any organization have. You have a vision, but how do you translate that vision into something that's really tangible? And that takes work, and that takes process, and that takes organization, and that takes sometimes fighting complacency. Multiple people have been attributed, you don't need a title to be a leader. Maxwell said leadership is influence, and my favorite one is the last one. It's from John Quincy Adams, one of the most intelligent presidents of the United States, in my opinion. And he said, if your actions inspire others to dream more, learn more, do more, become more, you are a leader. And that is a fairly potent and poignant statement. And finally, I guess my last one is remember, each one of us has to remember leadership is a decision. Leadership still is an obligation. Once you take on the role of leader, you're making an obligation to the people around you, to your family, to the people that put you in that leadership position. Because it's hard work. You're putting yourself out there. You're putting your first thing you do when you're a leader is you're open to criticism. And that's fair. And not everyone wants that. But you're there hopefully to make things better. And leadership is about connections, and it's about the future. I wish you really well. I mean, you're an organization that's played a huge role in this province and in various countries. And you still have a wonderful set of roles to play within Ontario, within Canada. I've had the pleasure of meeting some wonderful men, and I wish you well in your endeavor. And thank you for entertaining me this morning. Thank you.